Good afternoon, everybody, and my name's Andy Zoutr, and I'm going to be presenting a masterclass on mastering for you via BEATKNOTS. So welcome, everybody. Hope you're cool in 40-degree heat. Yeah, it's a lot, but let's get through this, and maybe you will learn something very, very important about mastering. I've certainly learned loads in the last 15 years of doing it, and I've been doing it whilst producing and for other people as well. So it's been a gradual learning process, and I've learned from more than one person, different techniques. People have different opinions all the time on things. So this is kind of my take on it, and also I'm trying to keep it a little bit unbiased. So, you know, when it comes to things like plugins and hardware, I've got some experience on hardware, so I know that hardware is really good to use for mastering. But I do a lot of it in the box, so let's just keep it open, and I'll give you the facts as I know them. It's not a dark art anymore, I don't think, and what I'm going to show you today is just everything I know about it, and furthermore, there's links so you can learn more from the back of something. You know, I don't want to go into too much detail. I've only got an hour, so let's get straight into it. So we're going to split this up into two parts. Part one is if you was preparing a mix to send to a mastering engineer. The reason we're doing this is not everybody wants to be an actual mastering engineer. So part two is what you're going to need, what you're going to need to work on, what you're going to need to know if you was to become a mastering engineer. So let's get into part one. Why do I need to master? Your music needs to sound its best on every medium. What do we mean by medium? We mean media formats, namely CD, vinyl, tape, and streaming. We're talking streaming platforms, the big popular ones that you know. And there is a need to master for these platforms specifically. So, for instance, a CD master and a vinyl master is completely different to a streaming master. I mean, some people will probably send just one off, but there's things that we're going to get into later with regards to the streaming masters. Now, devices as well. So you've got speakers, headphones, car and TV. There's probably many other things, but most things just have a speaker in them, i.e. car or TV, just got a speaker in them. So when it comes to headphones, that's something that I check on. I don't master in headphones, but I do check on them, okay? And as I said, this is not a dark art anymore, I don't think. When you had equipment looking at you like this, the Shadow Hills mastering compressor, it looks like you're about to get on a spaceship or an old jet plane or something. So it's quite daunting looking at things like that for the first time. Part of the fun is just twiddling knobs. So, art of mastering. You've got to trust your engineer. And if everybody else trusts them, you know they're a good engineer, yeah? It's got to have a good tone to it. Certain hardwares give a certain tone. Replication and plugins can give that tone, but yeah, that's another thing we'll touch later on, hardware versus software. Just to touch on that hardware, I mean like a compressor, physical in a rack unit with cables going into it, a plugin, just a piece of software in your digital audio workstation. Now the transients, this is talking about the peaks and not over squashing a song. You know, over squashed sounds squashed. Anything where you've got no dynamics in it is not pushing the speakers, it's not making the air move. So we like to make sure when we're mastering that a song has transients, okay? And it translates, like I said, to all the different media formats and the mediums. It's got to translate on all of them. So they're the 4 T's that I made up. Hope you like them. I've just put a little link in there as well to a piece on the dark art of mastering by Pitchfork. It's bringing to attention the equipment that an actual proper professional mastering engineer would use, and also giving examples of just excuse my mic's down there, giving examples of where mastering's gone wrong. So there's a little bit in that link there that tells you about when Metallica had an album out that was just completely squashed, did not translate on most things, and they had 100,000 people sign a petition to say it needs remastering. So that's an interesting piece on there, and the importance of good mastering. Yeah. So can I master it myself? There's websites like Sound Better where you can find someone to master your music for you, but let's just jump in on the deep end and say that you're going to learn to master yourself, right? There's other ones you can go and check out, and also Reddit. But why you shouldn't master your own songs? Here's the reason why. It takes years of practice. It can hold you back from writing new material. You probably over-listened to the song and you're sick of hearing it, or you can't objectively listen sonically. So there's some good reasons why you shouldn't. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm saying go for it. Why you should master your own songs. Let's go for it. Let's learn how to do it. Improve your critical listening skills. Let you step away. It's going to help you create better demos. It's certainly done that for me. I do think about what would the master engineer think? And you get to understand how a professional engineer works, which can give you better results. Okay. So the top 3 tricks I'm going to give you if you want to mix and master your own music: separate it out. Production stage, mixing stage, mastering stage. Try and complete your production before you start mixing. Try and bounce off your mix before you go to master. Listen to your end result on a multitude of systems you know really well. So whatever you listen to music on, listen to it on that over. And make sure you just trust your ears in if you always listen to music in the car, basically always use your car. Yeah. And always A-B your mixers. A-B means play A, song A, which it could be a reference track, and then play your song B. Flick between them. What's the problem? Is it as loud? Is it bassier? Always have good reference music. So just giving you some tips there, guys. The number one thing though, an additional one there, get your songs mixed and mastered by someone else so you can check how you're getting on. Yeah. So that's an additional tip there. Now, as we touched before, vinyl, tape, CD, I'm not touching on streaming right now. We'll touch on that on the next page. But with vinyl, there's a process you need to go through if you want to get that vinyl sounding great. I mean, I used to be a DJ, and sometimes there'd be a vinyl that I'd have to turn up. And that was down to the mastering. And some of these problems that you get, like harmonic distortion, not enough compression, it can ruin the track. And I decided I'm not going to play that vinyl anymore. So based on the mastering of a song, I might have liked the song. I've obviously bought the song, brought it home, compared it to other vinyls, and thought, well, doesn't match. And this could be mixing, but we're going to go with it's the mastering engineer's fault, because you have the opportunity as a master engineer to send it back. I don't know if you guys, I know you're all quite young, but I'm sure you've heard of a tape cassette. I don't know, we're guessing. But when mastering for tape, it's two-sided. So we need to split the whole master into two. So there's just a quick tip there. If you're ever to send off to a pressing plant who do tape runs, you need to just make sure they have 2 long tracks, or 3 tracks bounced together. Yeah. Now CD and DVD, obviously CDs for the music, but you can also do DVDs with the software that I was going to give a little bit of a rundown with later on. So when you're exporting from a normal project, you bounce off the audio. As a mastering engineer, you'd use Redbook or DDP software. We'll get into that later. So, but this software is for writing all the meta content, like track name, artist, and certain codes that we put onto the CDs. And just a little bit of info there. It needs to be 16-bit and 44.1 kHz, which is kilohertz. This is because that's, if you send it off at 48, it's going to sound slow. Yeah. Right. And as I mentioned, the next page, digital mastering. So this is where we're at the moment for probably 80-90% of artists. It's going straight onto the streaming platforms. And it's a bit of good news there, because we've always had a kind of needs to be loud, but the streaming platforms do something to your masters. So we need to be aware of that at the mastering stage. So we'll just touch that. LUFs, loudness unit relative to full scale, is a new standard for measuring normalization. It's quite useful, and it's better than trying to slam your tracks. It's now an issue of the mix has got to be great. Yeah. So with this, now we're looking at a lower number when we're uploading to the platforms. We'll get into that later. So Apple Digital Masters. I don't know if anyone's had heard of this, but it's an accreditation that Apple came with in 2012. It was originally called MFIT, and it's a way of preventing distortion when your track is converted to AAC. So it sounds pretty technical, but there's a little trick for that, and I'm going to try and get to show you in the end there. But if not, that's something where you can Google all that, and that'll give you how to do that. It's tricky, but it's worth doing it, because a lot of mix engineers can be annoyed if you've not took this into consideration. Okay, so there's the logo now. AI versus man. The many online services that master instantly. There's a couple there for you. And if you've not got a lot of money, it's worth trying it. Again, if you're trying your own masters, you might want to stick it through Landa, which is not too expensive, much cheaper than getting a human to do it, but it's not as good. But there you go. This is one of those things. It might be one day, but right now we're good. So I briefly touched on streaming platforms and how they unmaster, which makes your masters actually still pre-masters. And this is what it looks like. So we'll start with the pink. You see where you've got 19 LUFs, minus 19. So that's basically saying it's quite a dynamic master. It's got a lot of shape to it. Yeah, you can see is it turquoise? Not, we've got a bit of colour blinds issues there, but yeah, slightly greeny. Minus 4 LUFs basically means it's slammed. It's extremely limited. It's going to sound squashed. So if your mastering engineer sends your master off at minus 19, Spotify will make it minus 13. Increasing the LUFs by 6. So what we really want is to get close to what the streaming platforms are considering their LUFs. So here you can see they're all different. Some people just do not go by this. They just say, this sounds great, I'm sending it. But as you can see in the diagram on the left, it's going to change your song. So if you've really cranked it up and you give it them, they're actually going to turn it down. So you're better to leave the dynamic in there. You're better to go with the pink. Make sure you're not slamming it. And then just as long as the mix is great, you should be great. I think with mastering, less is more. I've slaved over masters for 2-3 hours sometimes and come back to it the next day. and it's the mix. It's not the master. It's not me. But yeah, passing the buck is not. I wouldn't say it's always the mix engineer, but it's kind of like a goalkeeper. In football, the defense. Let's say the defense is the mix engineer. It should never get to the goalkeeper. The goalkeeper shouldn't have to do a difficult job. You know, that's my analogy for that. All right, so when we're sending off these files to our mastering engineer, the big question is it mixed? Which is it's an awkward question, because a mix to someone is not a mix to someone else. But these are the credentials I would expect. Interleaved audio, so it's one block of data. Some headroom, which means it's not squashed, because I can't do much with a squashed mix. A high bit rate, a high sample rate, and either WAV or AIF. So there's a link there if you want to look at other formats, but WAV and AIF are the key ones for me. So this is what it should kind of look like. You know, your transients are good. You're not too squashed at the top, because we're going to do that at the end, and we're going to do a bit of squashing at the end. Yeah, the last stage is limiting. Yeah, so just to keep it light, guys, this always cracks me up. I always think about this. Sorry, there you go. Funny meme. So we're getting on to part 2 now. Mastering music, not just send it off to the master engineer. So we're going to get technical now, guys. So we're looking at what you need to become a mastering engineer. And the number one is an accurate room. You can get treatment for your room, and you can get software to measure the room. I'm going to give you some recommendations for, the kind of software that I use, the kind of software I'd like to use, budget. But this is just a list of what you need. The power in the room is pretty important. So if you can hear buzzing from the lights, from, heaters, you need to have your power conditioned. You need to have a separate fuse for the audio system. And yeah, also cables. If you get cheap cables, they can affect things. Excuse me. Accurate reference monitors. By monitors, I mean speakers. And there's different types. There's a lot of really expensive speakers. And if you're mastering, the main thing I would say is you need accurate speakers. Yeah, so that's the main point, is you need truthful speakers. Passive and active is basically saying whether your speakers have an amplifier within them. Active means they're powered. Yeah, passive means you need an amplifier also. So as you can see, number 4 is the power amplifier if you've got passive speakers. An audio interface is where you're hearing it through from your computer to the speakers. So having a good audio interface is very important. And when it's converting, so we're going from digital to analog to digital, especially when we're using hardware, this audio interface needs to be the best at that, because that's a stage where you can lose bits. It's going into a subject of dithering. We'll talk about that later. I predominantly master in the computer, in the box, like I said earlier. So I have an arsenal of plugins. Got a bit of a plugin problem, but yeah, it's addictive once you start buying plugins and then start sending you deals. So I'd probably spent more money on plugins than hardware over the years, but outboard and hardware are where the money's at. If you can get a really good mastering EQ and a mastering compressor, and you're onto a winner there, because they're expensive, but you can get quicker with them. I'll touch on that later as well. But for now, this is what you need for mastering. So obviously there's one key thing I'm missing there, and that's good ears. So I've gave you a little link there for Pure Mix, this is free. The website's actually really good. There's some great demos and tutorials on there, and I would recommend just going for the ear training. Just try it out, and it's that kind of testing frequencies, seeing if you know them, because you could find yourself trying to eliminate frequencies, and if you don't know what the frequency is, especially on hardware, it's quite painstaking. So that's what you need. And here are some of my recommendations. For the room calibration, there's room measurement, REW, sound ID, which I'm using, and Trinnov. You can see in the picture there, Trinnov's like kind of a setup of mics that you would measure a room with. It looks pretty technical and it's pretty expensive. So my recommendations for speakers, I would always go for my Amphions. I've had them for about 6 months now, but we've had them at the studio for a couple years, and they're very, very, very truthful. Yeah, really good. Amplifiers, so I've put there the Hypex one because everybody's talking about this one, and I haven't used many high class amplifiers over the years. I've only used the Amphion one that we've got at the studio, and then the Hypex one that I've built. So I've built one, and it's doing a great job. I only use it when I'm mastering, so most of the time it's off. So I'm scared it'll blow up one day because I built it. But it's working great for now. Audio interfaces, so I've got the UAD. We used to have an Apogee, and I've listened through a Crane. These are amazing audio interfaces, so I'd recommend one of those. And here you've got compressors and EQs that I've used. The Unison one I've not used, but yeah, all the others I've had a good go on and recommend them. Very expensive though. If you can get the software versions, do it. So on to the doors. Not the band, the DAWs. So you can see a list of music production doors, which I use Logic to master in at the minute. And I'm thinking of getting either Wavelab or maybe Sonora. So I'm going to ask a few more people and get some advice on these. But these mastering specific doors enable you to kind of lay the tracks out, as you can see in the picture, and export with the tracks kind of set where they are. It's really useful to do it like this, especially if you're doing a long player like a CD or a vinyl. It's really useful to hear the transitions and make sure the transitions are nice. And then when you're exporting, originally you just bounce to CD and it'd be called a Red Book Master. But now we've got something called Disk Description Protocol. So if I was to now export the master CD, I could do it as a file type with all the metadata inside, which is really useful. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting one of those and doing some long player mastering, because at the minute I'm just doing the mastering of tracks for streaming, so I'm not really setting up anything. I mean, not many people are doing CDs, but if I'm doing like a mixtape or something for someone, I would put it through something like Wavelab or Sonorous eventually. So on to software. You've obviously seen the different types of software there, but now I'm going to go into the plugins that I use or recommend for certain tasks. So when coming to restoration, and what I mean by that is if I've got a track where there's lots of noise, there's specific noise reduction tools like Waves and Isotope, and there's many others. But obviously I'm recommending them to you because I've used them and I know they're good. So this is RX, and as you can see, it looks really pretty. But what RX is doing is kind of getting into the soundscape, and you can see there, this is kind of nice to look at, but also really, really useful for getting rid of little instances that you don't want. You know, like a click or anything like that. You can get rid of it. So I'd start with cleaning, and then I would set up my chain so that I would clean the audio first and then export it. And then I would re-import the audio and then start to build my chain for what I think is going to be the best for this track. And within my chain, I would start removing, so subtractive EQ. Yeah, you can see there the peaks and the troughs. So this is FabFilter Q3. You can see the lower ones. It's very extreme. This is not a mastering EQ. I would never do mastering with that kind of EQ shape. It's just an example of the software. But as you can see, I've shown you this so you can see that it's cut down loads. But I may finally notch a frequency out in the mastering chain. So that's subtractive, where I'm taking away something that could be kind of swelly, or there's all types of different terms for the EQ spectrum, when it comes to things like warmth, and you've just got loads of terms that would describe different sections of the EQ frequencies. So the next thing I would do in my chain, I would put on a UAD Pultec or a Neve, a classic emulation of a hardware EQ, and then some subtle compression. The next thing I'd do, I'd add a multi-band compressor, which compresses different frequency bands differently. So I could have a really tight compressor on the low end, and then a subtle compressor maybe in the 10K. If I had sibilants or anything like that, I would have a very tight, subtle compressor around there. So with a multi-band, you can have two different compressors in different frequency bands, really useful, but also very easy to mess things up with those. So it takes a bit of getting used to and also testing. So it's a very, very, very useful tool though. The next thing I would put on is I'd saturate, which is kind of like distortion. But what I tend to do with saturation is I'd do targeted saturation. So maybe if it was a big bass track, I would saturate the low end, and that's it. I would leave the top pristine. And a great piece of software for doing that is C.A.N, but also there's BX there. Now top is more of an overall saturation. You could say tonality, but there's three of my recommendations for saturation. Transients we talked about before, where if I wanted this track to be a little bit sharper on the attack, for say it's a house song, and it sounds like it's a little bit flat with the dynamics, you could actually tweak the transients to make it a little bit more sharper. And then the other way, you could soften it if the transients were too hard. So let's say it's just pop in. We can soften that slightly. And with this mastering, each step is a subtle improvement or a subtle carve. We're not going in wild with that kind of EQ that you can see there. We're doing all subtle things just to improve as we go along, gradual improvements. And then a couple of recommendations for the saturation, for the transients, is SPLs and Soothe 2. So that's a picture of Soothe, but there's a Soothe 2. And the really, really interesting thing with Soothe, again, quite a subtle plugin, but I can't master without it now. It's basically like the multiband. It's a saturator where you can target the EQ band. So you can see there, this guy has kind of done a lot of transient soothing around the mid range, and then a little bit in the top. So that is something that I would definitely do on, say, a hip hop track, where the bass is big and boomy, and the sample and the drums are all coagulated, so you need to kind of define the transients in that stage, but also a little bit of sibilance reduction in the top end for the, say, the rapper and the hi-hats. So you can see Soothe there, great one that is. And the next step after that, I would probably EQ again, where it would maybe be a boost of the bass or a boost of the top end, subtle, to just bring it up. Now I've kind of treated it all. Or it could be that I'm just carving out the last of the bass that's still boomy to make it really sit tight. But then the EQ I would normally just use a Q3 fab filter for most of my chain, apart from that second stage where I'm adding a little bit of warmth in there. So reverb automation, it's a tricky one. Don't use it much, but sometimes I'm a little bit trying to finish a song for someone, and I'm thinking this needs something, and I might actually just put a tickler reverb in the drop down. Say if it's a dance track, I'll bring up the reverb as the drums leave, and then I'll drop it out just before the second drop or the third. This is more of a mix thing. Like, if I think it needs it, I'll do it. But it's, I don't do it much. And there you've got a couple of recommendations. Endless Smile by Dad Life, I swear by that. And it's a one knob plugin with only about 6 patches, but they all are great. Recommend getting that. So something that's very important, some would do this earlier on, but I tend to do it later on, is stereo width. So switch to mono. Is anything disappearing? Is it wide enough? Can I make it wider? Is making it wider, then when I switch to mono, is it disappearing? There's a good 10 minutes of just checks there, and Ozone's really good for that. And then the final stage is the limiter. So limiting is your brick wall where you're boosting at the end, and it's one of those things that if you do it too much, that's where you get the squash sound. So when limiting, this is where you need to start metering as well. So we'll get onto that in a second. But something very important is gain staging. So within each of these plugins, say I'm going from the EQ to the compressor. If I've EQ'd it and I've boosted some things, you need to check that it's not clipping. If it's clipping, I can bring the whole EQ volume down slightly. Now that's gain staging for me. Now with the UAD plugins, they're real life emulations of the original hardware, and it specifically gives you on the website the best volumes to hit each plugin with. So gain staging can be one of the things that you really nerd out on. But I would just say, just don't go into the next plugin distorted. Just keep everything subtle. Yeah. Okay. So that's some of my favorite software in there for you, and some little tidbits on how to get the best out of a mastering chain. Moving on. Metering analysis. So in Logic, which I use, there's a multimeter which gives you a great visual layout of what's happening with different settings and stereo width and all of that. But here I'm just giving you a view of what professional mastering engineers use. So this one is hardware, it's not software. It sits on the desktop and is a USB monitoring. You can also, I'd like to get one of these actually, but I've heard that you can also attach it to the signal. So if you've not got many USBs, you could just attach it to the signal and it still do the job. You can see there you've got all the measurements that you need to get that master dynamic for the streaming platform. So this is quite a new one, and I think it's probably a couple £100, but yeah, it's a nice one. Now there's a couple cheap ones here. I'm just showing you some cheap alternatives, especially for the LUF thing right now. This is giving you a dynamic kind of view, of the master where you can target it and you can see where it's building up. So it's really good for targeted, like targeting the right LUFs that you want to come out. Another one I've been using for years is the PAS analyzer from Waves. As you can see, the bottom, that crazy like character looking thing, is the stereo field, and the bits on the left and the right, it's what you don't want. You don't want too much on the left and right, because when it comes to a mono club, you're going to lose bits and bobs. Okay, this is quite a new one called Levels, and again, this is helping you to target the range you want. The dynamic range is important, so this is another metering tool that helps you target. So briefly, I wanted to just say some things about hardware versus software. Not that I know everything or much at all about hardware. I know that hardware is expensive, but also it enables you to be quicker. So let's just see this. Plugins are not better or worse than hardware. So if you want convenient modern recording solution, the plugin emulations are great. Okay. The thing we're missing is the warmth and the randomness of valves and transistors. So inside these actual pieces of hardware, you've got all kind of components that have been in there for years, that have been replaced. Like, there's a certain amount of randomization in there. You'll never if you bought some old secondhand software, say from a surplus place or army surplus, you would if you did an actual test with them, they wouldn't be identical. Over the years, things change in them, and that affects the sound. So sometimes these changes create like accidental sounds, but this is what some people go like swear by. They swear by using this specific limiter or this specific EQ, and you can't really emulate hardware 100%, but the hardware these days, the software, these days is really, really close. And so I just use software, but I would love some hardware. That's basically what I'm trying to tell you all. So let's touch on workflow. Once we're getting into it, this is what it looks like. So I've shown you my chain, but I wanted to touch on what I do first when I receive a song. So someone sent me this song to master. What do we do first? We listen, make notes, and I think about what I'm going to use as reference material. And when picking reference material, you don't want to be picking a shoddy MP3 that you've downloaded or ripped off YouTube. You want to be using potentially a WAV or AIF file or a FLAC, and something that's not been converted. Now, how does it sound is a very broad question. How does it make you feel is that kind of thing. If it's a happy dance song, let's go. Let's make it bright and happy. Yeah. If it's sad, we're not looking to make things, too shiny. And if it's not sounding great, don't be afraid to provide feedback. And the number one thing you can do is polish a turd. It takes you ages, but it's still a turd. Request a new revision if you think it could be better. And if a mastering engineer said to me, I think your low end is too high, I would send them a new version. I wouldn't argue. And that's just how it is. Just you've got to be open and honest. So stage 2, once we've listened to it and we've got a new revision maybe, we still might hear something later on that we need to adjust. So I'm talking about the RX software. Potentially we need to do some cleaning and potentially need to do some automation. So automation is where we're changing levels over time of specific plugins. So let's say I've got a track where the intro is coming in and the fade on the intro is a bit rushed or a bit sudden. Yeah, I could be potentially softening that intro with my own fade, or it could be like a reverb thing, like I said. But more times it's subtle fades on the intros and outros that I might need to automate, just volume. The next thing is mastering. So then we get on to the chain. This is the part where I talked about, this is my chain. Yeah, your chain could be completely different. But I'd choose and stack those plugins. And then I'd A/B reference, comparing to the reference material I picked. And also I'd be comparing to potentially the mix engineer's mastering reference. So a mix engineer might just stick a limiter on and say, this is my reference. I'd be A/Bing against that as well, just to check that I'm in the right ballpark and it sounds better. You've got to beat that reference material, guys. So as I said, in the automation stage, maybe it's just a normal fade. Add that, crop out any silence, make it nice and tight, bounce it, and if it's a track where it really needs to be the best, I might do a couple revisions, bounce those off, and sometimes I might just send both of those revisions and say, what do you think? Because this is the stage where it needs to be perfect. And if I'm second guessing stuff, like I'm not sure if this one or that one, I'm going to let them decide. And, you know, sometimes you might say, well, surely you should know. But there is subtle preferences when it comes to an artist. So this is going back to the artist and the mix engineer, potentially the producer, and potentially the sound engineer as well. So they all might sit in a room and go, oh, I like that one, I like that one. Why? They might discuss it and go, okay, we'll go with that one. It sometimes I think artists like to do that, you know. So I also think it's important to do revisions, multiple versions for, especially when it's a big one, yeah. And this is what I'm saying. The Prism audio, this is Prism sound is basically a really high-end D to A. So when you get into the end of it, you need a great interface to bounce these off, and that's an very important part, guys. The next stage for me, once I've bounced all these versions off, is I'm going to listen in the car. I'm going to listen on the way home, and I'm going to listen in my shed. Is it great? How is it sounding? Is everything clear? Does it have the same punch? Anything popping out? Does it translate well? If so, I'm going to upload it and I'm going to go to bed. And just hope that the client signs it off the next day. So that's what we're aiming for. Sign off. What does it look like in the future, guys? I mean, we've got AI now mastering, the Lander, the E-mastered, and one day they might take over and we can't touch it. It might be one day that we just send the mix to Spotify and they do the mastering. I mean, I've seen in SoundCloud they've got a mastering widget now where you can ask them to master it for you. So it comes to whether we want to keep the job, right? I mean, when it comes to cinema and real high-end like scoring, we've now got binaural, we've got Dolby Atmos, there's been 5.1, there's a new one out that I was reading about the other day, but I think there's a lot of master engineers right now setting up for Dolby Atmos, which is real expensive. Let's say I'm using Amphions, which, I mean, when I'm sending off songs to get mastered, I'm not always mastering my own music, guys, basically. So when I'm sending them off to get mastered, I get a chap called Henker, and he's a great mastering engineer, excuse me. And this is his setup. So as you can see, he's got the Amphions, he's got one in the middle, and then he's got 4 up top. Each one of those speakers is about £1,000. So that's potentially the future of a master engineer. Is you're not just stereo mastering anymore. You're having to make sure that the car noises in the background aren't too rumbly. Or the other thing I've noticed is a lot of people are hiring headphones, binaural headphones. They're really expensive. So what was really shocking is when I was working my day job, is there's a couple of people that used to hire these headphones and sit there and work. And I don't know if you ever listened to them, but they've got 3 different kind of layers. And to design and to master to these headphones is pretty freaky. You've got to take into account all the different kind of scenarios. And as you can see, this dummy looking guy, the Neumann KU100 dummy head, is what they're using now. I don't know what I'd do with that, but it looks great. It's about £7,000. So yeah, I'm just looking at the future and I'm thinking, yeah, where's it going? It's crazy, but it's really exciting as well. I mean, if you can get your hands on some binaural headphones and check them out, you will then know what I'm saying. But as well, when you go cinema, you can hear stuff flying over. You got to remember that's a mix engineer and a master engineer has been involved in that, and it's a big part of making your sound big. Okay. So there we have it, guys. Thank you very much for attending. If you've got any more questions at all, you can email me directly at andy.zoutr@gmail.com. ZOUTR. And if you did want us to master anything for you, you can hit us up at www.theelements.co.uk. So that's the Elements with a Z. But yeah, thank you very much for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it and you've got something out of it. And cheers. Have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
The song angels sing on a cloud far away. You're the song angels sing.